Let's do it. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Tree Planting for Future Generations webinar. We are excited to have you here. Welcome. So my name is Catherine Moravec, and I'd like to share with you a little bit about myself before we get started. First of all, I'm originally from the Denver area. I have a BS in biology from CU Boulder, and then an MS in horticulture from UC Davis. And I've worked in landscaping for over 20 years in a variety of capacities, from greenhouse manager to landscape installation to all sorts of different things. But the last 11 years have been at Colorado Springs Utilities as a water conservation specialist and a horticulturist. So my job is to help people figure out how to have wonderful, beautiful landscapes, but use water wisely. So here I am, everyone. It's good to see you. Normally, we would be offering this presentation as a live classroom setting, but due to the public health situation, we are transitioning to an online format. So I just wanted to say hello before we jump into the presentation, and also to bear with us as we jump into this whole realm of technology alongside of you. So let's cover what we're going to be talking about today. Let me advance the slide here. Okay, so here's our agenda. The first thing that we're going to do is review how Colorado Springs climate presents challenges when we're trying to grow trees. The second thing that we'll do is we'll talk about how you can choose a tree with proven success so that you're starting on the right foot. Third, we'll talk about how you can plant that tree using the best techniques available that we know of today. And then we'll talk about how to care for that tree long into its lifespan so that it thrives for generations. So what I hope that you get out of today is some inspiration, some information, and some resources to help you be successful when you're out planting a tree. I know that when I have the opportunity to plant a tree, at the end of the day, I feel like I've done something really good for the world. So let's go ahead and share the information about how you can be successful. So the first thing I want to cover is how the Pikes Peak region's climate presents challenges for trees. Prior to European settlement, Colorado Springs was a vast shortgrass prairie. And as you can see in this historical photo, this is the ecosystem in which this city was built. As you can see, there are little short grasses out there. And in this photograph, there is only one tree in the center that looks like some sort of cottonwood that's growing along a waterway. So really, east of the foothills, trees do not grow naturally here. But that didn't stop General Palmer. He actually arrived in the Pikes Peak region in 1869. He discovered the majesty of Pikes Peak. He had breakfast in Garden of the Gods and took a dip in Fountain Creek. And that experience motivated this entrepreneur and visionary to build his dream town that he wanted to make into a beautiful, wonderful place, a resort community full of amenities. So here's a historical photograph that you might be familiar with that shows the men who were surveying the area that would become Colorado Springs. And in this photograph, once again, you can see these tiny little grass plants that are able to sustain themselves on the climate, the resources provided by the climate in this area, but there are really no trees. So the question becomes, why didn't trees grow here? Well, it's because the Colorado Springs area is a semi-arid climate. The total precipitation on average between rain and snow is only 16 inches. And this area also experiences periodic drought. On average, we go into drought once every 10 years. So the bottom line is that there just wasn't enough precipitation to support trees east of the foothills. It is an ecosystem that's able to support short grasses, but not trees. But General Palmer knew that a semi-arid shortgrass prairie was not going to attract buyers from the eastern United States. So He had this vision of creating these beautiful tree-lined streets here in Colorado Springs. So he initiated a massive tree planting effort in 1871. And here's how they did it. They took cuttings from cottonwood trees in the Canyon City area and transported those up here into Colorado Springs and planted them along the sides of the streets. Now you can see that by 1916, especially this historical photograph from Cascade Avenue, these trees had gained an impressive amount of size and were really transforming the environment here in Colorado Springs. But these trees were not sustained on what nature was providing alone. And in fact, General Palmer knew that he needed to do a water project to be able to irrigate these trees so they would thrive. So in 1871, his private company initiated what was called the El Paso Canal, which was the first water project that brought water from Fountain Creek to Colorado Springs. And as you can see in this photograph, right next to these beautiful trees is an irrigation ditch on the left-hand side, and that is the El Paso Canal. So what would happen is they would bring this water from Fountain Creek to Colorado Springs, and they diverted it down these major streets, and then they would lift these gates to flood irrigate these trees. And that system worked very well. Now in 2020, the importance of water is even greater today. This is a picture of Colorado Springs, and as you can see, the vast majority of landscapes that we've built in our city require consistent irrigation. But here in the arid West, water is a limited resource, and we have a growing population as our community continues to expand. So wise landscape water use is more important than ever. And that's why Colorado Springs Utilities supports these types of webinars to empower you to be able to make wise use of the water that our community has. At the same time, trees provide very important benefits to us. They create shade, which is extremely important in an urban environment. They support wildlife by providing wildlife habitat and food. They improve our air quality. They create beautiful aesthetics and support good human well-being in our community. They also are part of our stormwater infrastructure. They help control erosion, and they create a very unique sense of community. So all these benefits are really important to us. So if trees are important, and yet they use water, and water is a limited resource that is precious in our community, the question becomes, how do we integrate trees into our community for the best long-term success? So here are some practices that I would like to share with you today to help you help our trees succeed in our climate. Because the reality of the matter is that without our support, trees don't grow here. So we need to be the factor that provides trees with what they need and steward our water resources the best that we can. So here are the 3 things that you can do to help trees succeed. First of all, we want to make sure that we're choosing good species from the get-go, because the better species that we choose, the more likely those trees are able to succeed. The second thing we need to do is really plant those trees with smart planting techniques, because there are some right ways and effective ways to plant trees, and there are some ways to do it that don't work very well. So we'll cover those. And then over the long term, we need to be providing our trees with regular watering and occasional pruning over time. And we'll go over that as well. So let's transition into this section about how to choose a tree with proven success. I'm going to cover 7 characteristics of successful trees. Now, depending on what ecosystem in which you're planting a tree, we might be looking for different characteristics. So if you're in a high rainfall area, you might have a different set of characteristics than we need to use here in the Colorado Springs area. So let's cover the 7 characteristics of successful trees for the Pikes Peak region. First of all, you want to choose a tree that has an attractive appearance. Because aesthetics are one of the major benefits that trees provide, we want to make sure that we're choosing trees that are going to look nice in our landscapes. Second, you want to make sure you're choosing a tree that has proven cold hardiness. And what I mean by that is we want to plant species that have the ability to withstand the extreme cold snaps that we might get every few years in the winter. Third, we want to choose trees that have no major insects or disease issues, so we're not having to manage those trees intensely over their lifespan. We want to choose trouble-free trees. Third, you want to choose a tree that has good drought tolerance. Because we go into drought every few years here in the Pikes Peak region, you want to make sure that you're not investing in a tree for 10 years that's going to be damaged or even killed by a periodic drought that we know we're going to experience. So make sure that you choose a tree that has good drought tolerance so that when we do go into drought or into water restrictions, your tree has the ability to withstand that. You also want to choose a tree that has a moderate to slow growth rate. And I know for some of you that are a little bit impatient, this can be a challenging characteristic, but this is really important. Here's the reason why. When we choose trees that have a fast growth rate, what happens is that the trees will grow pretty well for a little while, and then they're very susceptible to storm damage. So if we're able to focus on choosing trees that have a moderate or slow growth rate, those are the trees that will grow for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and be able to withstand all the crazy weather events that occur here in Colorado. We also want to choose trees that are not likely to cause damage to driveways and sidewalks. I'm sure you've been walking in your neighborhood and had to go over a little hill of broken concrete because there's a tree root lifting the sidewalk. And that's not only problematic for our infrastructure, but it can also be dangerous. So there are some trees that are very likely to damage concrete and others that are not. So let's choose the ones that are less likely to damage that. And then lastly, if a tree is able to fulfill all of these characteristics, we want to be able to buy them easily from nurseries. So those are the things that I'm going to share with you, the trees. They'll fulfill these requirements. So now I do want to review two special situations before we get into the species recommendations. The first one is if you're planting in the public right-of-way. The public right-of-way is city-owned property that is between the curb and the sidewalk, or it may go a little bit past the curb or the sidewalk into your yard. The right-of-way can be a variety of different distances, but it's always measured from the curb into your yard. So if you're planting in the parkway or in the city right-of-way, just be aware that the city has specific trees that they will allow in that area. And the way that you can find that list is you go to the Colorado Springs City Forestry website and look for the approved street tree list. It's very important that we choose trees that are going to be successful in those parkways. And so you need to check out that list before you do that. Keep in mind that you will need a permit to be able to plant a tree in the right-of-way. But don't be intimidated because the permit process is very easy. The city just wants to be aware of what tree you're planting in that area, to understand that you're aware that there is an approved street tree list, and to make sure that they can support that tree in the right-of-way over the long term. The second situation that you need to be aware of is if you have an active homeowners association in your neighborhood. If you do have an active HOA, be aware that that HOA might have specific species requirements or size requirements for trees being planted in the neighborhood. So check with your HOA to see if they have any requirements before you go out and purchase a tree. All right, so now what we're going to do is review the top 10 recommended trees that I would target for beginners or people who want a surefire tree that's going to last in the Pikes Peak region. Now, keep in mind that these top 10 recommendations are not the only trees that we recommend for the Colorado Springs area. But because we have limited time, I'm just going to go over the top 10. If none of the 10 that I mentioned today actually suit your fancy or fit your needs, be aware that we do have a top 30 list at this website at csu.org. And this top 30 list is just a list. It goes over shade trees, evergreen trees, and small deciduous trees that are water-wise that have proven success here in Colorado Springs. Now, if you see something on that list that sparks your interest, or if something in my presentation today makes you curious about that particular tree, I'd recommend that you go to our website, waterwiseplants.org, because at that website, you'll be able to find a photo gallery for each tree and a lot of supporting information. In fact, let me show you a quick screen capture for what you might be able to find about Amur maple. So when you go to waterwiseplants.org and you look up Amur maple, you're going to find a photo gallery of that particular tree species throughout the season. You can find its height and width and its water requirements. And then down below, you'll be able to find a detailed description, maintenance techniques, and additional information to help you be successful with that species. So in the presentation today, I don't have a lot of supporting photographs for you because I want to be able to get through the information, but this is where you can find additional images and supporting details. So let's go ahead and get right in the top 10 list. The first tree that I'd like to talk about is ponderosa pine. Now, you may be a little bit surprised because this is a tree that grows in our natural areas. It's a native tree. In fact, it's probably the most prevalent evergreen tree on the east slope of Colorado. However, ponderosa pine makes a great landscaping plant. I mean, it's perfectly adapted to our climatic conditions. It's drought tolerant, and it has a beautiful open form with gorgeous needles and beautiful pine cones. In fact, when I go and visit older homeowners associations that might have been planted in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, oftentimes I'll find that the ponderosa pines have aged really well. So this is a great tree that can kind of be your bread and butter tree in your landscape, particularly if you're planting in a low water or naturalistic area. I mean, in fact, if you think about it, most landscapes don't look like they're a Colorado landscape unless they include some type of evergreen. So a ponderosa pine can be a really great choice. The attribute that I'd like to talk about now is the fact that ponderosa pines drop their lower limbs naturally. So you can see in this naturalistic setting, this ponderosa pine, the first branch is probably 6 to 8 feet off the ground. Now, if you're trying to screen a ground level view, a ponderosa pine is probably not the right fit. However, if you want to plant an evergreen tree in an area where you have fire concerns, this can be a wonderful attribute. Because if a wildfire were to come through this area, as long as it's got sufficient clearance between the ground vegetation and the lowest limbs, it's not as likely as that the fire is going to jump into the canopy. So definitely consider ponderosa pine, and don't forget about this one. Even though it's not a flashy, gorgeous deciduous tree, it is something that will last you for a long time and provide a lot of value to your landscape. Now, if you're looking for more of a shade tree, I would certainly recommend taking a look at thornless honey locust. Now, these are a selected cultivar of honey locusts, or a group of cultivars of honey locusts that don't have thorns. They are beautiful trees. They are very adaptable, so you can plant them successfully in medians or small spaces, and they will grow. They are amazing, resilient trees. One of the best attributes that I like about the thornless honey locust is that rather than having a large leaf, They have these little tiny leaflets that are about the size of your fingernail. And this is a really nice quality because it creates this dappled light shade environment underneath a honey locust. So if you're outside on a brisk, cold Colorado morning in the summer, this dappled shade can really be a nice environment where you're getting partial sunlight peeking through. The other nice thing about these tiny leaflets is that if you do not like to rake leaves in the fall, having a thornless honey locust can save you a lot of work, because as the leaves drop in the fall, once we get our first big winds, it'll just blow all those little tiny leaflets away. The other nice thing about a thornless honey locust is that many of the cultivars, when the leaves emerge in the spring, they have a bright yellow color that adds a lot of value to the landscape. And then in the fall, they have a beautiful gold tone. So don't forget about thornless honey locust. That can be a really nice, easy care, low maintenance tree for your landscape. The third tree that I'd like to talk about today is pinyon pine. Once again, this is a native evergreen tree to our area, but pinyon pines can make a wonderful landscaping plant. First of all, if you want to plant an evergreen tree that requires minimal extra water, then consider pinyon pine. These are the evergreen trees that grow in rocky, low water areas naturally in our ecosystem, but they're very beautiful. Now, keep in mind that if you're planting in a landscape setting, you do want to give their pinyon pines some extra water, particularly if we get into an extended drought condition. So don't think that you can't water them at all. You do want to water them periodically, but in terms of trees that can survive with minimal water, pinyon pine is one of the best options. The other nice thing about pinyon pines is that they stay relatively small. So they might be 15 to 25 feet tall and wide. And because they hold their branches all the way down to the ground, they can be really good options for screening. So the other thing about pinyon pines is they have a really beautiful little cone that contains edible seeds. And in fact, that's where we get pine nuts from. The next tree that I like to talk about is thornless cockspur hawthorn. Now, this is a really good tree if you're looking for a smaller tree for your landscape. This tree will get about 15 to 20 feet tall, but it also has this beautiful wide spreading habit. Now, this can be a real asset in the landscape because if you've got beautiful landscapes plants planted underneath your thornless cockspur hawthorn, it can really create a visual, appealing situation where you've got this spreading canopy above and then your landscape also spreading below. Thornless cockspur hawthorn is a drought-tolerant tree. It's performed very well in the Colorado Springs area. Very easy to find in local nurseries. It has beautiful white flowers in spring, and these white flowers are followed by red berries in later summer and into the fall. And you can find pictures of all of this at waterwiseplants.org. The other thing that I really like about thornless cockspur hawthorn is that it has these beautiful glossy green leaves. So even if we go into a dry period in the middle of summer, thornless cockspur hawthorn has these glossy green leaves that don't fade. They stay glossy and green, and they make everything look really nice and lush throughout the summer. So another small tree that you might want to consider for your landscape. Now, if you want to plant a tree for your great-grandchildren, this is the tree to plant, a bur oak. Now, in the Colorado Springs area, many of the oaks do very well. Bur oak, chinkapin oak, Texas red oak. But I particularly like bur oak because it becomes this grand, stately, amazing shade tree over many decades. Now, this is a slow grower. So if you don't want to have a slow growing tree, this is not the tree for you. But if you have time to invest or you want to plant a tree for future generations, certainly consider bur oak. It is one of the best options for a long-lived shade tree. The other thing that's really nice about bur oak is that it leaves out late in spring. Now, this may seem like a negative quality, but believe me, in our climate where we have late spring snowstorms that cause a lot of branch breakage, the bur oak is the tree that will leaf out late, miss all of the spring storms, and then grow beautifully for the rest of the year. So even though they leaf out late, that's a good quality here in our climate. And the nice thing about bur oak is that, like other oaks, it produces acorns in the fall in a good year. And the bur oak has this cute little frilly ring around the acorn that is really attractive. The next tree that I'm going to talk about is hackberry. Now, hackberry doesn't have anything about itself that is really amazing and show-stopping, but I will tell you that if you go around to different areas in the Pikes Peak region and you see a moderate-sized shade tree that is trouble-free, it's very likely that it's a hackberry. Hackberries are very resilient to drought, so they don't seem to be damaged by drought conditions or extended water restrictions, and they're very resilient to storm damage. The other nice thing about hackberries is that they produce a nice shade tree and they have a moderate growth rate. So unlike an oak, which is relatively slow growing, a hackberry will put on more growth each year, but still not get damaged by a lot of our spring storms, unless it's an unusually terrible one. Hackberries have a really nice gold yellow fall color, so they can be a really good shade tree, especially if you want a shade tree that you don't have to worry about. Consider a hackberry. Now I'm going to talk about Princess K plum. This is a tiny little tree. So if you want to tuck a tree in a corner or you've got a very small lot, you might want to consider a Princess K plum. They only get to be about 15 feet tall and wide, but they are gorgeous little trees. One of their best attributes is that in spring, before the tree leaves out, it has these beautiful double-flowered light pink blooms. And when this tree is in bloom, it is a showstopper. Those flowers are just amazing. And the pollinators like them too, so it's a great food source. Now, even though this is a plum tree, it doesn't produce any fruit. So if you're looking for a fruit-bearing tree, this is not for you. But in terms of a beautiful ornamental that can do well at higher elevations and withstand our climate, this is a gorgeous little tree. Now, the thing that I like about Princess K plum is that in the fall, its leaves turn a variety of colors, including yellow, orange, and red. So take a look at its fall color and you might be sold on planting one of these trees in your landscape. Okay, this is the last evergreen that I'm going to talk about, but this is Vanderwolf pine. This is a selection of our native limber pine. So Vanderwolf pine does a really nice job withstanding our weather conditions here on the Front Range. Because it's a selected cultivar of limber pine, it was selected for these beautiful blue-green needles that have kind of a bluer tint than the pinyon pine or ponderosa pine. And it has a more tidy, upright pyramid shape. So if you need to plant an evergreen tree in a more narrow area, you might want to consider a Vanderwolf pine. It has a moderate growth rate and good drought tolerance. I would certainly also encourage you to take a look at the pines instead of blue spruces. I do not have blue spruces listed in this presentation because blue spruces are native to the western slope of Colorado. And if anybody has gone skiing or hiking, you're aware that the western slope of Colorado, the mountain areas, get a lot more precipitation than we do on the Front Range. So even though some of the smaller blue spruces might be appropriate for landscapes, they're very competitive for water, and I consider them more of a medium water plant. So I think that if we focus on using pines, we'll be more successful in the long term than using blue spruces primarily. Okay, if you're looking for a spring flowering tree, you might want to think about planting a crabapple. If you've ever driven around Colorado Springs in May and noticed an explosion of white, light pink, or dark pink flowers, then you have noticed the amazing profusion of blooms that crabapples provide in spring. Now, crab apples are not the perfect tree, but they can be a really good tree if you follow several characteristics in terms of selecting one. Crab apples also have very interesting bark and attractive leaves. They have good fall color, so they can be a great addition to a Colorado Springs landscape. Now, there are a wide number of cultivars of crabapple. A cultivar is simply just a specific type. Like if you think about dogs, there are different types of dogs. Same thing with certain types of trees. Crabapple is a species of tree, and cultivars are the types of crabapples that there are. If you go to buy a crabapple in a nursery, you're going to find that there are single stem or single trunk specimens available, as well as multi-stem. In this photograph, you can see that there's a single stem in the foreground of the photo and a multi-stem in the background of the photograph. And this is really nice because this gives you a lot of different design options as you're choosing a tree for your yard. Now, if you're thinking about choosing a crabapple cultivar, here are a few things that you want to keep in mind. First of all, you want to definitely make sure you understand its mature size because different cultivars of crabapples are different sizes. There are some that are small, like maybe 15 feet tall and wide, and there are some that get to be pretty darn big, maybe 40 to 45 feet tall and wide. So make sure that you're choosing a crabapple that's going to fit your landscape in the long run. The second thing you want to keep in mind when you're choosing a crabapple is what it's going to do with its fruit. So once those beautiful blooms fade in the spring, they may or may not turn into fruit. If you do not want a crabapple that's going to bear fruit, there are some cultivars that don't produce any fruit. They're sterile or fruitless. Spring snow is a perfect example of a fruitless crabapple. So if you want that, make sure you're choosing that up front. Now, out of the cultivars that do bear fruit, there are really two types. Some cultivars produce their fruit and then they drop that fruit to the ground. Um, so make sure that if you're getting one that'll drop its fruit, you have the ability to clean that fruit up, or that it's going to drop the fruit in an area where it's not going to be an issue. The other type of fruiting crabapple is one that has what's called persistent fruit. And the persistent fruit is where it actually hangs on the tree all the way through the winter months until the birds eat them up. So those can be nice because you get the ornamental value of the fruit, but you don't have to do a lot of cleanup underneath the crabapple. The third thing that you want to keep in mind when you're choosing a crabapple is you want to choose one that has fire blight resistance. Fire blight is a disease that periodically comes through Colorado Springs, and crabapples and apples are susceptible to this disease. So make sure that you're choosing a cultivar of crabapple that has greater resistance to fire blight than another cultivar. Because what you don't want to do is invest 15 years in growing an amazing crabapple tree, and then if we have a terrible fire blight year, you lose that tree to the disease. Colorado State University Extension has a wonderful list of fire blight resistant cultivars. So definitely start with that criteria and then decide about the fruiting, the mature size, etc. Okay, so we are going to have a questions pause in 3 slides, but what I want to do is pause for about 30 seconds to give you some time to enter in your questions. So we'll have some time for you to type those in. We'll resume the presentation for another 3 slides, and then we'll take our question break. So go ahead and type in anything that you might be wondering about. Okay, so feel free to go ahead and continue to type in your questions as I talk about these last 3 slides. So if you're looking for a mid-sized deciduous tree, consider Hot Wings Tatarian maple. This is a very, excuse me, Drought tolerant, mid-sized tree. It gets about 25 to 35 feet tall and wide, and it's a really attractive tree. Now in Colorado, we've been growing Tatarian maples for a long time, but the Hot Wings one has a special characteristic. In the spring, it has these tiny yellow-green flowers that are really nothing to write home about. But in July, those little tiny flowers mature into these beautiful bright red crimson seed capsules that have great ornamental value. So even though the tree is not in flower in July, it looks like it's covered with red blooms. Those seed capsules stay on the tree for about a month and then they blow away. So if you're looking for something that's going to provide some midsummer interest, Tatarian maple, the Hot Wings cultivar, is a really good option. And then in the fall, the leaves turn a range of red to orange tones, which add additional ornamental value to this tree. Now, if you're going to purchase this tree, make sure that you purchase the Hot Wings cultivar. In the nursery, you can buy a regular traditional Tatarian maple, but what you'll find about those trees is that when they produce their seed capsules in the summer, the seed capsules will be a light green to a light pink color. If you want that bright red color, make sure you purchase the Hot Wings cultivar. This is a relatively new type of tree in the Colorado nursery trade, and the growers have been producing single stem specimens as well as multi-stem specimens. So the multi-stems are actually quite beautiful. You might want to consider that if you're looking for something where you're getting additional trunks at ground level. Just make sure you have space for that in your landscape. The last tree that I'm going to talk about today is linden. Now there are different types of lindens and they come in a variety of sizes as well. But the smaller to mid-size cultivars of lindens seem to do really well here in Colorado Springs. If you're looking for a tree that has a more traditional, tidy shape, you might want to consider planting a linden because they have this sort of pyramid, broad spreading shape at the base that goes to a more narrow shape at the top. And it will maintain that shape without a lot of supplemental pruning. In addition, lindens have an amazing fragrance when they're in bloom. There are multiple lindens planted around the East Library in Colorado Springs. So if you ever have the chance to go there in late spring or early summer when they're in bloom, you can experience this intoxicating fragrance that is just wonderful. The other nice thing about lindens is that they're very adaptable in their water use. So they can tolerate and they probably prefer moderate moisture, which means that's a great option for you if you're going to plant it adjacent to or in a lawn area. If you plant a pinyon pine in a lawn, that pinyon pine is not going to be happy. But if you plant a linden in the lawn, it will be as happy as a clam. So it's a good option for front lawns or back lawns where you've got a smaller lot. In addition, lindens seem to do pretty well if they transition to low water over time. So they can be quite adaptable. In addition, they have this bright yellow fall color that adds a lot of ornamental value to the landscape. So this is a good one to consider if you want a nice deciduous moderate sized tree. Now, where should you be buying trees? I would certainly encourage you to buy at your local nurseries. There are additional retailers that sell trees in our community, but I really believe in our local nurseries. And this is really for two reasons. Because many of our local nurseries have been in this business for generations, they usually carry the species selection and the cultivars that do well in the Pikes Peak region. So if they've been a successful business for a while, you can be guaranteed that they know what's going to work here in our community. In addition, our local nurseries have gotten really smart over time, and they tend to purchase their stock from Intermountain West growers. This is a really good thing for us because we live in a low humidity environment. There are a lot of trees that are grown and produced in the coastal areas like Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and they produce beautiful trees. But when we transplant those trees into our low humidity environment, they can go into a lot of transplant shock. On the other hand, if you're choosing a tree that was grown in the Intermountain West where it's already low humidity, that particular tree is less likely to experience major transplant shock when you plant it in your landscape. So another good reason to buy at your local nursery. Now, my understanding is that a lot of our local nurseries have adapted, and they are doing curbside pickup currently, so you might want to give them a call and see if they have the tree that you're looking for. Okay, so with that, we're going to go into our first question session. Oh, and I should mention that my coworker Julia is here managing our Q&A session for us. So thank you, Julia, and please go ahead and let us know if there's anything that people have questions about.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. So the first question, Catherine, is this: which is more likely to have success, a sapling or a larger caliper tree from the nursery? I've been told that saplings tend to have a better success rate since they establish a better rooting system more quickly.
Oh, that's a great question. I think you're exactly right on target. So when you go to a nursery, you can choose from a variety of sizes. Some will be in a nursery bucket as small as 5 gallons, all the way up to a 3-4 inch caliper tree. If you have the time, I would certainly recommend choosing a smaller tree because I believe that they transplant quicker. And just as you said, they grow a better root system more quickly than a larger caliper tree. Now, some of your HOAs might have size minimum requirements that would force you to buy a 2-inch caliper tree. And if that's the case, then you need to go with what your HOA is requiring. But there's nothing wrong with starting small.
Okay, Catherine, next question. Which are the good fruit trees we can plant in our yard?
Okay. Oh, I love this question. That's a good one. So I have really taken a look into the successful fruit trees and that will work in the Pikes Peak region. And the answer to that is apples, sour cherries, European pears, not Asian pears, and European plums. So out of those options, those are the 4 that consistently produce fruit in our climate. The problem that we have with fruit trees is not that they are not cold hardy. There are lots of cold hardy fruit trees out there. But what we have is we end up with cold snowstorms and late spring freezes that knock all the blossoms off. So for example, an apricot is a beautiful ornamental landscape tree, and certainly think about planting an apricot, but you can expect to get fruit on that maybe once every 10 years. So if you want to get fruit, apples, and if you plant an apple, you need to make sure that you plant 2 because you need one to pollinate the other one. Sour cherries, which are typically self-fruitful, European pears, and European plums. And if anybody has any particular trees that they've been successful with fruit-wise, please go ahead and type those in the Q&A box, and we'd love to learn from you.
Okay, Catherine, next question. What's a good friend-producing tree?
Could you repeat the question, Julia, please?
What's a good friend-producing tree? I think they mean one that your neighbors are going to be happy you planted.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, there's a couple of trees. So let's answer the opposite of that, which is what types of trees are your neighbors not going to be happy with? Well, one, if it produces a lot of litter or trash, or if it produces a lot of seedlings that they're going to have to spend a lot of time picking all the seedlings out of their own yard, or if it's going to send roots over and create colonies. So things like aspens, cottonwoods, silver maples, those are all trees that you should avoid. In fact, the Colorado Springs City Forestry website has a great list of prohibited trees, and you can't plant those in the right-of-way. But that's good advice. We really shouldn't be planting those in our landscapes anyway. because they just have lots of problems. So on the flip side of that, any of the trees that I talked about today in our top 10 list, or any of the trees that are on our top 30 list or at waterwiseplants.org, those are free of major concerns, and you can plant those with the understanding that they will make friends and not enemies.
Okay, Catherine, one last question. So where should I plant trees?
Okay, that's a great question. That's going to lead us right into the next section. So anything else we should talk about, Julia, before we move on?
Looks like that's it for now.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right back into the presentation here. Okay, so that question just leads us right into this slide. Where should you be planting trees? It's very important to select a location wisely. Now, in an ideal world, you would want to make sure that you're planting away from concrete, so 10 feet away from a driveway, 7 feet away from a sidewalk, and no closer than 30 to 40 feet from your house. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, that means I have no place to plant my tree. And I hear what you're saying. So just try to plant away from your sidewalk or driveway, and don't plant right up against your house, because that will cause problems in the long term. So do the best you can with these guidelines, but they're not hard and fast rules. If you live on the west side of I-25, you definitely want to take into account firewise principles when you're planting trees, so that that tree is adding value to your landscape and not creating a hazard. If you're planning on planting a shade tree, you might want to consider planting that tree on the southwest side of your house, and that way the tree will provide shade to cool your house in the summer, but then allow sunlight to enter your windows in the winter and warm your house. If you want a windbreak for our winter winds, you might want to consider planting a conifer or evergreen on the northwest side of your house. Okay, now we're going to move into the planting techniques, and I want to point out that I'm going to go into the details of the planting techniques, but we have a 90-second video on our website that summarizes everything that I'm going to talk about here. In addition, we also have a very simple fact sheet that will go over tree and shrub planting steps. So we'll talk about it today, but if you need to review these steps, then go ahead and do that right before you plant with the video and the fact sheet. All right, so when you buy a tree, if you're planting it yourself, it's more than likely that you're going to buy a containerized tree that will come in a black nursery pot. So when you get the tree and you're ready to plant it, the first step is to remove it from the pot. And then what you want to do is remove any excess soil from the top of the root ball. What happens when trees are grown in the container is sometimes soil gets piled up and layered on top of the trunk, and you want to remove that before you plant it. So this is important to do before you dig your hole, because this is going to determine how deep you're going to dig the hole that you plant the tree in. So what you're looking for is you want to just use a tool to remove any soil that's pushed up against the trunk, and you're looking for what's called the root flare. The root flare is a natural widening of the trunk that indicates that you're getting closer to the roots. You want to take away all of the soil against the root flare, because the root flare should not be buried. So on virtually every type of tree that you plant, you do need to remove maybe 1 to 2 to 3 inches of soil on top. If you don't do this, then what's going to happen is you'll bury your tree too deep, and then over time your tree will not thrive. It'll just won't establish well, and it'll have problems. The second step that you want to do is you want to cut off any circling roots. Oftentimes when you remove a tree from a nursery pot, you'll find that you've got this kind of a sheath of circling roots that have hit the container and started circling around. It's very important to correct the circling roots before you plant the tree, because if you don't, then what'll happen is you'll plant the tree and the roots will just continue to circle, and eventually the root ball will kind of strangle itself. So you want to shave the outer portion of the root ball if you've got circling roots. So how do you do that? Well, here's what you do. Now, this is a photo that's courtesy of Dr. Allison O'Connor from Colorado State University Extension. This was a tree that she planted in her landscape. So what you do is you actually take a saw and you remove the outer 1/4 to 1/2 inch of the outer root ball. And you want to cut off all those circling roots. So all the roots that are left are just coming straight out from the trunk of the tree. Now, this can seem like a very scary thing to do, but I can guarantee you that if you do this right, you follow the right planting techniques and the watering guidelines, your tree will not experience drought stress. In fact, research has shown that you can remove up to 25% of the roots without causing drought stress as long as you follow all the other recommendations. Okay, then once you've prepared your root ball, what you want to do is dig the hole. You want to dig a wide saucer-shaped hole. So in a best world, what you could do is dig your hole 3 times as wide as your root ball. So if your root ball is maybe 12 inches in diameter, you would want to dig a 36-inch diameter hole. Now, when you're out there digging, you will start to question yourself, do I really have to dig this hole as wide as 3 times as a root ball? And I would certainly encourage you to spend the time to do that. Because what you're doing is you're creating a zone of loosened soil that will encourage the roots to grow out from the existing root ball into the native soil. And that is critical for establishing trees. Now, in terms of how deep you plant, you only want to dig your hole as deep as the height of the root ball because you don't want your root ball to sink over time. So wide, saucer-shaped, and a shallow hole. Once you've got your hole dug, you place the tree gently in the hole. And to firm the soil, you're only going to do that at the base of the tree. So once you put your tree in the hole, you add a little bit of soil in a ring around the base of the tree, and then you firm that soil. Then once you've got the tree firmed in the hole so that it won't fall over, then what you do is you shovel the soil that you dug out from the hole back in as backfill. There's no need to add anything fancy to the backfill. You don't need to add compost. You don't need to add any additional products or fertilizer. Just replace the existing soil back in the backfill. Do not put any soil on top of the root ball because you don't want water to be wicked around the tree. You want to have the soil from the root ball at the same grade or slightly higher than the soil you're putting back in the backfill. Okay, once you have replaced the soil, you want to create a little berm around the edge of your hole to hold water. This little berm is really nice because as you water over time, it'll keep the water right around the root ball and prevent it from flowing outwards. Now, this is really hard for some people to do, but when you're done planting, only use water to settle the soil and fine tune the grade. Do not stomp on the soil because you don't want to undo all the work that you did digging that wide saucer-shaped hole. You want to leave that soil nice and fluffy so the roots will grow into it. Do not smash it. After you're done building the berm and fine-tuning the grade, then you want to make sure that you're adding mulch. You add a depth of 3 to 4 inches of wood chips, shredded wood, or bark from the edge of the root ball to 3 to 4 feet out. Do not put any mulch up against the trunk because it will retain too much moisture and potentially cause bark damage. After you're done planting, then you want to make sure that you're watering regularly. Every time that you water, you want to add 1 to 3 gallons right on top of the root ball. For the first 1 to 2 weeks, make sure that you're providing the tree with 1 to 3 gallons of water each day. From weeks 3 to 12, make sure that you're watering every 2 to 3 days. And then from week 12 and beyond, make sure you're watering once per week. And you want to keep this up for 1 to 2 years, depending on how big your tree is, except for in the winter. So this is summertime watering guidelines until you see this tree start to establish and grow some new leaves and new branches. Okay, so you may have heard that the City Council of Colorado Springs passed water-wise rules, which are outdoor watering rules that go into effect this year. So you may be wondering, do you need what's called an establishment permit due to the new WaterWise rules? The WaterWise rules are intended to put rules in place that allow us to water up to 3 days a week with our overhead sprinklers, and to restrict watering to before 10 a.m. or after 6 p.m. But keep in mind that these WaterWise rules are really in effect for sprinklers, for lawn areas and other landscape plants. So if you're using drip irrigation, watering cans, or a hose watering method with a shutoff, those types of watering methods are not governed by the WaterWise rules. So if you're using that method to water your new tree, you do not need a temporary watering permit that allows you to water more frequently or water between 10 and 6. Now, on the other hand, if you plan to water your new tree with overhead sprinklers and you want to water more than 3 days a week or between 10 and 6, then you would need to apply for an establishment permit. And you can find out more information on that at csu.org. Establishment permits are really intended for landscaping projects where you're installing new sod or new seeding projects. And just to reiterate, sprinklers are generally not an effective way to water a new tree. So make sure that you're providing drip irrigation or hose end watering or using a watering can to make sure you're getting the right amount of water on your new tree. Should you stake your new tree? Well, you should only do that if it's in an extremely windy area. Now, you may be thinking that every area in Colorado is windy, and that's true to a certain extent. But what research has found is that by creating a scenario where the trunk is held unnaturally immobile, or that trunk is held still, more still than it normally would be, it actually makes the trunk weaker. When a tree is planted, if you don't stake it and it's that tree is allowed to move naturally in the light winds that we have, then that trunk will become naturally stronger over time. If you're planting in an extremely windy area, then you do want to go ahead and plant, then use staking materials, but allow some give in the trunk so that that trunk is able to move back and forth. If you do stake your tree, make sure that you remove all the staking materials, the straps, the wire, the stakes, after one full growing season. Okay, so we're going to take another 30-second break for you to enter in some questions. And then what we'll do is we will cover the long-term care section and we'll have our final question break. All right, so let's cover just a little bit of high-level information about post-planting care. So as your tree becomes established and it starts to be in uh, its normal life cycle, one thing that we want to make sure that we're doing to support our trees over the long term is to make sure that we are watering consistently. It's really tempting to think that we're going to get a tree started and then we'll cut the water off, but I would caution you against doing so. It's extremely important to water trees consistently to maintain them in a healthy state over the long term. So here are our guidelines about how you would water a tree that is mature. You do not have to water a tree 3 times a week. You can do it as little as 1 to 2 times per month, assuming that you have chosen one of the trees that we recommend that has good drought tolerance and a moderate or low water need. Every time you water, or I'm sorry, on a monthly basis, you want to make sure that you're providing about 10 gallons per inch of caliper per month. So in other words, the caliper is the diameter of the trunk at chest height. So if you, for example, have an 8-inch caliper tree, so a trunk the trunk is 8 inches in diameter, then you would take 8 times 10 gallons and you would provide that tree with 80 gallons per month. If you're watering 1 time a month, you would do all 80 gallons at once. If you're watering 2 times per month, you could do 40 gallons at each watering. Now, if you have an evergreen tree, you can cut that estimate in half because evergreen trees have about half of the water requirement as deciduous trees. Now, where you place that water is extremely important. We often see people that put one drip emitter right up against the trunk of the tree. For a mature tree, that is doing nothing to help that tree take up water. What you want to do is apply that water at the drip line. The drip line is the area of soil that's directly under the tips of the branches. That's where the water absorbing roots of mature trees are. So you can do that with a soaker hose, you can do it with drip irrigation, you may have sprinklers that hit that area, but that's where you need to actually water your tree. So focus on the drip line to about 5 feet outside of the drip line. Another thing that you need to do is top dress your mulch. You want to make sure that you're adding mulch on a yearly basis to maintain a 4 to 5 inch layer, 4 to 5 inch deep layer of mulch around your tree. Now, I know that it frustrates some people that the fact that mulch breaks down, but that's a really good thing. Think of it like a slow release fertilizer. As that mulch breaks down, it adds organic matter to the soil. That releases nutrients. It also helps air and water move into the soil and creates a better rooting environment for your tree. So maintain that 4-inch deep layer of mulch every year. Research has shown that maintaining a mulch layer under a mature tree is actually more effective than fertilizer in terms of supporting a healthy growth rate and tree health over time. So if you are thinking about fertilizing your tree, just transition that thought into adding mulch and maintaining that mulch over time. Now, once again, that mulch ring around the tree could be as small as 3 to 4 feet in diameter, but in an ideal world, it could go out as far as the drip line. All right, now 2 more slides before we get to our question session. I wanted to talk a little bit about converting landscapes under mature trees. If you have a mature tree in your landscape and you want to change the ground plane landscaping, make sure you read our fact sheet before you do so, because there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. First of all, you want to make sure that you're converting that landscape carefully under a mature tree and not damaging the root system beyond what that tree can withstand. You also want to make sure that you're considering the long-term water needs of that tree. We do have on our website a mature tree and shrub watering guide that summarizes the information that I've just discussed, and we will make that available to you in the recording and the links. But what we find is that some people take out all the grass under their mature trees and they put in unplanted rock. And what we find is that the tree will do pretty well for about 3 to 5 to 7 years, and then the tree will just die. So if you want to maintain that tree over the long term, as you're converting your landscape, make sure that you're figuring out how you're going to water that tree. The other thing that we would recommend is that as you convert an area under a mature tree, don't cover the ground plane with more than 30% rock. Now, the ground plane can be covered with landscaping plants, it can be covered with grass, it could be covered with native grass, it could be covered with wood chips, mulch, bark, or rock. Just make sure you're not doing all rock under your tree, because what we see is that those trees that are planted in rock will slowly go into decline. All right, and then our last slide here is about structural pruning. I'm not going to go into the details of structural pruning, but I just want to make sure, raise your awareness that young trees do need some structural pruning over time so that they grow into structurally sound mature trees. What happens is that young trees, when they're planted, they have too many branches, and those branches are too close together. Um, If you just leave that tree without doing any trimming on it, then as it grows into a mature tree, it's going to have too many branches that are not structurally sound, and it'll be susceptible to storm damage. So what you want to do is select the strongest branches and keep those in place over time while removing some of the less strong branches or the branches that are just too abundant, so that you end up with a structurally sound tree in the long term. Now, you can either learn how to do this yourself, or you can hire an arborist to do it for you. If you want to learn how to do it yourself, then I would point you to the Colorado Master Gardener Garden Notes. There are some very detailed instructions on how to train young deciduous trees and evergreen trees that are wonderful resources for you. And then the last thing I want to do is mention the Colorado Springs 150 Tree Challenge, the COS 150 Tree Challenge. So to honor General Palmer's legacy, as our city celebrates its 150th anniversary, our mayor has encouraged the citizens and businesses of Colorado Springs to aim for planting 18,000 trees in our community. If you happen to go out and plant a tree anywhere in our community, in your own yard or at your business or another property, consider tracking that tree in the Colorado Springs Tree Tracker, and your tree will be counted towards the 18,000 goal. So with that, I would like to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, Catherine, we have a couple questions. The first is this: my neighbor frequently uses herbicides to treat weeds in our shared parkway. I'm worried that the herbicides are going to leach into the soil and kill my tree. Is there a better method I can recommend to my neighbor?
That is a good question. You know, it depends really on what type of herbicide they're using to control the weeds, to determine if that's going to cause a negative impact to your tree. Now, we know that some weed and feed fertilizers that are typically used on lawns, those can be taken up by trees and can cause damage to them. Then there are other types of herbicides that actually get bound up in the soil pretty quickly and don't seem to have as much impact on mature trees. So you could certainly research those, or we could give you some private recommendations potentially, or you could go to a mechanical way of controlling weeds and maybe try a 3 to 4 inch mulch layer if that's appropriate in the parkway. So I don't have a magic bullet for you, but I do think that is something to continue to research and to investigate to see if there's some safer ways.
Okay, great. Another question. I had some very large elms removed. Are there guidelines on where I can position a new tree, and how far from the old trunk area stumps were grounded out?
Okay, well, that's a good thing. If you invested in getting the stump ground out, then you don't have to necessarily worry about how close you're planting to the existing stump. Because hopefully they got most of the trunk out. There will be some larger structural roots there. So what I would do is I would go out and start probing the soil. You want to make sure that you're probably staying 2 to 3 to 4 feet away from any large structural roots. So it might require digging some holes. But if you find a good spot, your hole might be partway dug for you. So there's no real specific guidelines to follow on that, but I think you're going to find that it's more of a practical question about where you're going to get a sufficient sized hole that you can actually tuck a tree into.
Okay, Catherine, one more question. Is Colorado Springs doing the tree giveaway this year?
Oh, that's a great question. Stay tuned for that. I don't think that that decision has been fully made. So keep an eye on our website to see if the Arbor Day tree giveaway is available. That's a great giveaway. What it is if you sign up online, then you can be eligible for a free tree. So be sure to keep your eye on the website. That's the place where you're going to get the most updated information on the tree giveaway.
Okay, Catherine, that is all I have.
Okay, sounds good. Well, just a few last things before we close. First of all, thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. And I'm so glad to know that there's people out there that care about trees just like all of us. But a few closing points for you. We will send out an email with a link to the recording, and we will include all the links to the resources, and we'll get that to you in a few hours. Next, if you have any ideas about how we could improve these webinars so they better suit your needs, please go ahead and type those recommendations in the Q&A box, and we will take a look at those, absolutely. And we'll leave the Q&A box up for a few minutes so you can get all those tidbits of feedback to us. I do want to mention that we are having future webinars as well. Next week, we have smart watering practices. The week after, we're having the best water-wise plants and grasses webinar, followed by water-wise landscape design and water-wise vegetable gardening. Now, these are the next 4 upcoming classes. We have a full schedule available at csu.org, and we would certainly encourage you to join us for more webinars. So with that, thank you all very much. Happy planting, and please stay in touch. Thanks for joining us.